Sienna God, hello all. Osta afternoon, good afternoon, and Wado, thank you for watching. So this is day 2 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. This was not mere idle talk. Among the steamboat explosions in the South, one on the Mississippi in 1838 killed well over 100 people. My God. And another near Baton Rouge in 1859 killed more than half of the 400 people on board and badly injured more than half the survivors. What the heck? This is crazy town banana pants. Southerners were just as reckless on land, whether in escapades undertaken for the excitement of the moment or in the many fights and deaths resulting from some insult or slight among people, end quotes, touchy about their honor and dignity, end quote. Again, all of this went back to a way of life in the turbulent regions excuse me, of Britain, from Britain, B-R-I-T-A-I-N, from which white Southerners came. Nor is it hard to recognize in these attitudes clear parallels to the behavior and attitudes of ghetto gangs today. I was literally thinking that as I was reading this. Like, it doesn't have to be a gang or whatever. It's people with that mentality. They have a blatant disregard for anything moral or whatever, anybody's life or whatever, even their own, only because they are leading with their feelings and not with logic. Who kill over a look or a word or any action that can be construed as quote unquote dissing them. Pride had yet another side to it. Among the definitions of a quote-unquote cracker in the Oxford Dictionary is a braggart, and is quote-unquote braggart, B-R-A-G-G-A-R-T, one who quote-unquote talks trash. In today's vernacular, a wisecracker. More than mere wisecracks were involved, however. The pattern is one said by Professor McWhinney to go back to descriptions of ancient Celts as, in quotes, boasters and threateners and given to bombastic self-dramatization, end quote. Examples today come readily to mind not only from ghetto life and gangsta rap, but also from militant black quote-unquote leaders, spokesmen, or activists. What is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of a distinctive quote-unquote black identity. When in fact they are part of a centuries-old pattern among the whites in whose midst generations of blacks lived in the South. Any broad brush discussion of cultural patterns must, of course, not claim that all people, whether white or black, had the same culture, much less to the same degree. There are not only changes over time, there are cross currents at a given time. Nevertheless, it is useful to see the outlines of a general pattern, even when the pattern erodes over time and at varying rates among different subgroups. The violence for which white Southerners became most lastingly notorious was lynching. Like other aspects of the redneck and cracker culture, it has often been attributed to race or slavery. In fact, however, most lynching victims in the antebellum South were whites. Look, I'm gonna tell you, right now, I could laugh at it, right? Because it's so gosh dang ridiculous. When I was reading this book before, I was so livid. I couldn't freaking believe it. I could not believe it. I could not. This is, what? That's why I'm telling y'all, you gotta homeschool your kids, because the history they're teaching us, it just ain't right. Economic considerations alone would prevent a slave owner from lynching his own slave or tolerating anyone else's doing so. It was only after the Civil War that the emancipated blacks became the principal targets of lynching. But by then, Southern vigilante violence had been a tradition for more than a century in North America, and even longer back in the regions of Britain from which crackers and rednecks came, where quote-unquote retributive justice was often left in private hands. Even the burning cross of the Ku Klux Klan has been traced back to quote-unquote the fiery cross of old Scotland. Oh my God. Used by feuding clans. Economic activity. The observers of the white population of the antebellum South often commented not only on their poverty, but also on their lack of industriousness or entrepreneurship. A contemporary characterized many white Southerners as quote-unquote too poor to keep their slaves and too proud to work, end quote. A landmark history of agriculture in the antebellum South described the poor whites this way. They cultivated in a casual and careless fashion small patches of corn or rice, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, and garden products. Women and children did a large part of the work. The men spent their time principally in hunting or idleness. The men were inveterate, inveterate drunkards, and sometimes the women joined them in drinking inferior whiskey. God, with these words. Licentiousness, licentiousness, was prevalent among them, among their equals. The men were quarrelsome and inclined to crimes of violence. The poor whites were densely ignorant. Their labors tended to be intermittent, often when they were pressed for money rather than a steady employment career. Frederick Law Olmsted called it quote-unquote lazy poverty, with whatever work they did being done in quote-unquote thoughtless manner. Summarizing his observations in the antebellum South, Olmsted said, and that's Olmsted, I know what while men seldom want an abundance of coarse food in the cotton states, the proportion of the free white men who live as well in any aspect as our working classes in the North on an average is small, and that the citizens of the cotton states as a whole are poor. They work little and that little badly. Oh man. They earn little, they sell little, they buy little, and they have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. Their destitution is not material only, it is intellectual, and it is moral. Yeah. When Olmsted found work done efficiently, promptly, and well during his travels through the South, when he found, he found well-run businesses, good libraries, impressive churches, and efficiently functioning institutions in general, he almost invariably found them to be run by Northerners, foreigners, or Jews. Nor was he the only visiting observer to reach such conclusions. Another observed that, in quotes, nearly all of the Old South's successful storekeepers were either Yankees or Yankee-trained Southerners, end quote. A French visitor said that when you saw a plantation in better condition than others, you would often discover that it was owned by someone from the North. From the North, y'all. We were always told, I almost said we were always told the Northerners didn't own slaves. It was just the South. And the North was trying to liberate the slaves of the South and stuff, right? A history of Southern agriculture presented this picture of North Carolina in the early 18th century. Many of the inhabitants were rough borderers who lived a crude, half-savage existence. Some were herdsmen, dependent mainly on the product of the range and, I'm trying to fold this page real quick, so I want to do another video on this freaking page. I can't freaking believe it. Okay, it's that paragraph that I read that I was like, oh my God. They told us. Anyway, mainly on the product of the range and, in quotes, under the necessity of eating meat without bread, end quote. There were also many thriftless and lazy families who had been attracted to the country by the mild climate and the ease with which our bare livelihood could be obtained by hunting and fishing, raising a little corn and keeping a few head of swine, and possibly a cow or two on the range. On the other hand, there were small farmers, many of Northern or European extraction, living industrious and thrifty lives amidst a rude abundance and considerable diversity of food supplies. They maintained good-sized herds of cattle, swine, and sheep, and the women made butter and cheese. Quote-unquote borderers at that point would refer to people from the borderlands of Britain, those included in what Professor McWhinney and others have called the quote-unquote Celtic fringe, and what Professor Fisher called quote-unquote, and Fisher is Fischer, Northern Britons, Britons, While the making of butter and cheese might seem to be an unremarkable activity in most rural communities, butter and cheese making by those farmers of non-Southern origins was in fact exceptional in the South. One of Frederick Law Olmsted's complaints during his travels through the antebellum South was the scarcity of butter, despite all the cows he saw. Even among plantation owners, he said, in quotes, "As for butter, some have heard of it, some have seen it, but few have eaten it," end quote. That's crazy. Hard data support his conclusions about the scarcity of butter in the antebellum South. Despite an abundance of cows, in 1860, the South had 40% of all the dairy cows in the country, but produced just 20% of the butter and only 1% of the cheese. As a study of antebellum Southern agriculture noted, in quotes, "attempts to stimulate greater attention to commercial production were futile," end quote. And even the bluegrass regions, end quote, imported a large proportion of the cheese consumed, end quote. The study concluded, in short, while the South abounded in cattle, the reported production of dairy products was very small. A table based on census statistics shows that some of the southern states, such as Texas and Florida, had far more cattle per capita than important dairy states like Vermont and New York. And in most of the southern states, cattle per capita were nearly or quite as numerous as in the northern states. Yet the production of butter and cheese per capita in most of the southern states was insignificant as compared with per capita production in the principal northeastern states. A speaker before an agricultural society in Orange County, North Carolina said, in quotes, "It is a reproach to us as farmers and no little deduction from our wealth that we suffer the population of our towns and villages to supply themselves with butter from another Orange County in New York," end quote. In colonial times, butter was imported from as far away as Ireland. Where butter was not imported, it was often produced locally by people of non-Southern origins. As the scholarly history of Southern agriculture reported, in 1858, the dairies producing whole milk for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, were described as, in quotes, "probably as well conducted as any in the country," end quote, but almost without exception managed by Swiss or German operatives. Meanwhile, a newspaper in South Carolina said in 1857, in quotes, "Good butter is indeed a luxury to almost every planter in the southern country, and there is perhaps no one article of food that is more eagerly sought after," end quote. In antebellum Virginia, a Richmond newspaper likewise complained of the scarcity of good butter, saying that the quality of butter available in the local market, in quotes, would hardly be that thought good enough to grease a cartwheel, end quote. When considering legislation to try to remedy the situation, a member of the Virginia legislature attributed the poor quality of the state's butter to carelessness with which Virginia farmers prepared it. One reason for the contrast between the abundance of butter and cheese produced by German farmers in states like Wisconsin, for example, and the scarcity of butter and cheese in the South was the German farmers, wherever they were located, tended to build fences and huge barns for their livestock and to feed them there during the winter. Southerners more often let their cows and hogs roam freely during the winter, even though this meant that in quotes, in the spring they turned up half starved and it took the summer for them to put on normal weight, end quote. This too was a continuation of patterns found among their ancestors in the British Isles and was part of a more general pattern of carelessness. Many other observers noticed the broken fences and the stunted cattle running at large. Unfed and unprotected, their manure was put to no use. Artificial pasture long remained a rarity, and few farmers stored feed for the winter. In Virginia, a French traveler of the late 17th century saw, end quote, "poor beasts of a morning all covered with snow and trembling with the cold, but no forage was provided for them. They eat the bark of the trees because the grass was covered," end quote. Wild animals, wolves, bears, and savage dogs attacked the helpless cattle and made the raising of sheep difficult. Germans were better able than Southerners to milk their cows regularly and prepare dairy products, while cows owned by Southerners were more likely to run dry after calves were weaned. A contemporary observer said that even Southern farmers with many cows will not, and this is in quotes, "will not give themselves the trouble of milking more than will maintain their family." end quote. That's crazy. As late as the 1930s, a scholar studying the geography and economy of the South wrote, in quotes, the close attention to duty, the habits of steady, skillful routine accepted by butter fat producers of Wisconsin, as a matter of fact, are traits. And there went some dough. I've got dough on my fingernails. I have a loaf in the oven. I was like, let me knock this out real quick. Let me see. Hang on. There's a scholar study wrote, in quotes, the close attention to duty, the habits of study, skillful routine accepted by butter fat producers of Wisconsin, as a matter of fact, are traits not yet present in Southern culture, end quote. At that point, the southern states, with 26% of the country's dairy cows, produced just 7% of the processed dairy products, such as butter, cheese, ice cream, and condensed milk. There was a similar contrast between German farmers and southern farmers when it came to clearing land for farming back in pioneering days. Germans cleared frontier land by both chopping down trees and laboriously removing their stumps and roots, so that all the land could be plowed thereafter. Southerners more often cut down the tree or even simply girdled it and left it to die and rot. But in any case, leaving the stump in the ground and plowing around it, although the erosion-prone soils of the southern uplands have been blamed for the poverty of the whites living on them, nevertheless, on that same land, Germans, in quotes, were able to cultivate the hill soil, some as to avoid erosion, and were willing to expand upon it the additional labor which is topography required, so that these soils in their hands, end quote, yielded excellent regular returns, end quote. Comments on the lack of enterprise by Southern whites were made by numerous observers in various parts of the South. And Alexis de Tocqueville's Tocquevilles, V-I-L-E and then apostrophe S, clearly, classic Democracy in America, he contrasted the attitudes toward work among Southern and Northern whites as being so great as to be visible to the casual observer sailing down the Ohio River and comparing the Ohio side with the Kentucky side. These were not just the prejudices of outsiders. In quotes, no Southern man, end quote, South Carolina's famed Senator John C. Calhoun, C-A-L-H-O-U-N, said, still in quotes, not even the poorest or the lowest will under any circumstances perform menial labor. That's crazy. He has too much pride for that, end quote. General Robert E. Lee likewise declared, in quotes, our people are opposed to work. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule and resist it, end quote. Many whites, and this is in quotes, many whites, according to a leading Southern historian, were disposed to leave good enough alone and put off changes till the morrow, end quote. Wow. Very similar kinds of comments were made about these Southerners' ancestors in the parts of British Isles from which they came. Although the term quote-unquote lazy appears frequently in comments on these people on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been no evidence of any such aversion on their part to strenuous physical activity in dancing, fighting, hunting, and other recreational activities. So sloth was not the real issue, nor have rednecks or crackers been prominent in such less physically demanding activities in entrepreneurship or scholarship. It is the nature of the particular activities in which they have taken an active interest and on which they have expended their energies, rather than the physical demands of those activities that seem to have been crucial. Not only did many of the groups who settled in the South disdain business as a career, as their ancestors had in those parts of Britain from which they came, they typically lacked the kinds of habits necessary to be successful in business. Among the habits needed to run a business, none is more basic than a steady application to the tasks at hand, doing things in a quote-unquote business-like way. But those relatively few Southerners who did run businesses often displayed no such business-like attitudes. Even when there was business to transact, Southerners would often stop to go watch a cockfight or a parade or visit a saloon or go hunting, end quotes. In traveling in the South, a Northern visitor commented in the 1850s, you could become astonished at the little attention men pay to their business. What? Such views were not confined to the Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses, according to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Inquirer. end quotes, attributed the success of Northern